This week we're talking about domination theory and how it works within a cycle system. And I've talked a little bit about the dominant and the dominated and how they view themselves, and that most of the time this is actually just a mental thing and not an outward thing. Uh, it's quite the shock for people to recognize what's happening from a domination cycle. And in the next video after this, we're actually going to talk about why people don't recognize it. But for now, I'm going to show you the actual cycle. This is a very brief cycle here. And if you want to look more up on this, look up Clayton Christensen. He's actually a business analyst, and he wrote something called Disruption Theory. And he actually was, he wrote all the designs for what you're seeing here, only I'm using it historically instead of for innovation. So you can also look up blue ocean things, or a blue ocean promotion, or whatever the term is, and it does the same thing. How do people get into markets without bloodying themselves? Well, they go to different markets, and the same thing happens there. These are businessmen who are looking at business, and they don't realize that they've just done a bunch of cultural historical work. And so I'm just showing you what they were talking about, only in a cultural historical point of view. So there we go. It's, by the way, this is a very slow power change. It doesn't happen, instantaneously. So it tends to happen in a few generations. So you'll see why. First off, the dominated, to enter into the room and to survive, or into the area and survive, will take on any crap jobs that they can do. The colonists in Manhattan. Hi, Kayla. They what do we call it? They would take on medical jobs, and they would actually take on communication for guns and supplies for the natives there. Their medicinal practices would help alleviate certain problems going on. They weren't good medicinal practices. I want to point out that this was, bloodletting and stuff like that, and they didn't know about, properly cleansed equipment, but it was better than the other options given. So they were given a lot more power within medical systems. But they were still viewed very, very poorly, not only by the Native American tribes there, who were letting them live, literally just letting them live, but by the English nation state and other countries around them. So the colonists were not viewed highly. They were not given a lot of respect, and the best way they could survive was to take on crap jobs so nobody would notice. This is migrant farm workers. They do the same thing. They take the crap jobs, and we kind of ignore them. This has been going on since the 60s. And during the 60s, people were just like, just let them do it. I mean, they're going to go away anyway. They're going to go back to Mexico. And they continued staying because there was still work to be done. And where I'm from, in Yakima, they continue to take on jobs so much that they now are the major population. So, I've watched this happen. And this same thing happens in multiple ways. Crap jobs for whatever reasons. They're not crap jobs always in the way that you think of it. They can be jobs that nobody wants to do, not in the fact that they're difficult or labor intensive. It's just a job nobody wants to do, or something that you'll be like, oh well, okay, I respect you for that. Whatever, stay over there. In other cases, it's literal crap that they have to deal with. The Eta in Japanese culture were so demeaned that their only job was to take care of crap in the city. They had to pick it up, they had to use it, that was their job, was to clean up refuse and all that stuff. And being even near them was considered kind of, being rejected by society. So you can imagine these people take on the crap jobs because they usually lose if they don't. And this is the Virginia colony. It's very famous for losing all the time. every single frickin' battle they had. They declare themselves so brave and warriors and great and stuff, and then the Native Americans would just come in and wipe them out. And the only reason the colony stayed is they would just constantly have more people coming in and immigrating, and the weather was so bad that they would freeze to death. So, and the crops wouldn't grow here. And it just wasn't something that any of the colonists knew how to survive with. And several times they would get on a boat and try to travel out, and there would be a new ship of colonists coming in. So they'd be like, "Oh, fine, we'll stay for another year or two." And this is how it worked, year in and year out. And these were the lucky ones. These were the lucky ones. Other colonies simply disappeared. There was a famous one in Manhattan where the colonists were there and they just kind of disappeared. And everybody's like, "Oh, it's mysterious." But really, they left notes saying, "We're going to go join this tribe." And this tribe happened to have a bunch of people that looked like, Europeans. So everybody understands that they simply gave up and joined the tribes. But if you watch any horror show, they talk about the mystery. And this was a very common thing. People would send in colonies or set up forts and be like, "Oh, look how powerful we are." And, within 2 years, they'd be wiped out and the fort would be left to smolders. So it was every reason to take on a crap job, because if you don't, you will lose. And this is the mindset of the people who are going into this area. They already understand that they are the losers. They are the dominated people, and they have to accept it if they want to survive. And the dominant see this, and they're like, "Oh, well, see, they're not important, so we're going to deal with true politics here, true politics, where they go and they snip at each other, and they take on each other, and as they're fighting, new jobs and new things start to fall into territories. The butlers kind of haven't been doing too well, so maybe we can give that job to the crap job people, and they can become butter when we can get butlers that way. I mean, it's a crap job anyway. It's just a slightly higher crap job. And, in their minds, this isn't that big because these are still crappy people doing crappy jobs. And they'll fight against each other. They will set up armies of people they consider crap and have them fight against each other. And they don't realize how big this group is getting. Or in their minds, they're like, "Well, this group isn't that important because they're still taking on any job I don't really want." And so the dominant fight each other. They straight up fight each other in the northern in the New York area. One of the reasons why the colonists were able to gain power was the tribes were fighting against each other so much and dealing with diseases that they were being wiped out. They were wiping each other out, and the colonists just started to move into those areas. It wasn't because the colonists were doing anything special. In fact, the colonists had nothing to do with it. But the dominant fought against each other so much that they started to leave openings. And this is basically the same story for every tribal area you will find in the U.S. and in the Americas. And the same thing for all other groups that you will look up. They weren't losing because they, were attacked by some unnoble horde. It was because these unnoble hordes were filling in the voids. In the minds of the dominant, they set up systems that make the dominated fight against each other. This is the former Yugoslavia, and what the USSR did is they would break the people apart by ethnic group, and then even if there wasn't an ethnic group, they made a new ethnic group, and because of this, they would just break apart and break apart and break apart, and then they'd give privileges, and privileges would be like food or praise or some form of kindness. Not great kindness. Everybody here was treated terribly, but treated nicer than the way they were beforehand. And they just have them fight against each other. And as the dominant do this, they think, well, we've got them contained. They are fighting amongst each other, so therefore I don't have to worry about them. And that usually doesn't work out because the dominant tend to be fighting so much amongst themselves that they lose all their power, and then the only people left are the dominated. Uh, in the minds of the dominant, the dominated will never become dominant. They cannot achieve such amazing civilization. The Irish, there was a group called the Irish Rich, and these were newly rich Irish who were trying to be, good and proper, but they would mess up on manners and stuff. And the traditionally rich were just like, oh well, they don't know how to use the hanky correctly. They don't know how to bathe themselves correctly. They don't know these things. We can look down upon them, even though they're making more money than we are. And the same thing happened in England at the same time. Scrooge, I was about to say Scrooge McDuck. No, it's Ebenezer Scrooge was considered a newly rich, or a newly rich. He inherited a lot of he inherited a lot of power, but you'll notice he doesn't have a lot of money. He has a lot of influence, but he has to spend a lot of money to keep that influence, and he knows it, which is one of the reasons why he's such a miser. He's so scared that he's going to lose his position that he's not spending any money. And it scares him. And it takes a lot for him to be like, no, I can use this money to help others. I don't have to be scared of it anymore. And this was a very common thing throughout Europe, where even if you had attained new riches, the noble class, as they call themselves, would be like, well, you're not really us. You're not allowed to own land. You're not allowed to do things. We are still greater than you. And this caused, the French Revolution and many other things. And this is another thing you're going to have to realize, is that we have several layers of domination. Just because you're being dominated doesn't mean that you're not dominating someone else. And just saying, oh, well, I'm dominating someone else does not mean that they are not dominating someone else, or that, the fight you're having with such and such group does not mean that somebody above you doesn't want that to happen. And it's a fascinating group of, every historian who studies it can get confused on which group is doing what. And I've tried reading books on it, and I honestly can't follow them every time. So this is what happens. The dominant give up the unneeded areas. They tell everybody, oh, well, we don't need this land. We don't need these people. We don't need, that lake over there. It's unimportant. They can live in the crappy land. They can live in this crappy land over here. Or, the civilization that, you just wiped out, and you're like, I don't really want the land they were living on. I just didn't want them to challenge me anymore. So let these new colonists in. And by the time, 150 years have passed, or, a couple hundred years, and this is the Americas, or the U.S., in the 1811. Hey, Corey. And this was almost entirely people just kind of moving in, and then moving in, and then moving in. And almost everything to the west of, I don't know, was considered, almost Indian territory. They were scared that the Indians would attack, or the natives would attack them at any time. So, these new states were very new, and honestly, they weren't viewed very highly amongst the people who were more on the coastal areas. They were less, if you will, and they started to rise up and gain power, but amongst all the dominated groups that they were amongst, or the dominant groups that they were amongst. And, if you look, you can see Chicago right there. And the history of Chicago, and you're like, oh, yeah, I can see why. To survive, they created these systems. And to keep, and during these systems, they started to gain power and money and influence. And by the time they were influential, they had all these amazing things. And this created a problem, because that meant bad cultural markers were going to stay. I decided not to show you a picture of such and such, of this, because if I were to show you them, you'd be like, oh, well, that's a tradition. And I don't really know how to explain this, but a lot of the the cultural things that we're talking about to make you survive when you're in the crap job level will actually allow you to be a horrible human being. And that sounds rude, but it's true. Like I said, I lived in a ghetto, and I had friends who had parents telling them to go get pregnant or get raped so that they could get pregnant, and I am not joking on the matter. So they would be told to be doing these things. But if you look at the level of poverty where I lived, it wasn't as bad as, several country or, third world countries, but it was bad. And these groups, my friends, were, being pushed by these traditions that the families hadn't recognized as a bad idea. I literally had friends whose parents were telling them, "You're a bad daughter for not getting pregnant," when the daughter was like 14 years old. And it blows my mind sometimes, just the insanity that I saw. But these were bad cultural markers, and nobody was saying, "Hey, maybe you should stop this. Maybe you should stop thinking about it in this way." Instead, they would say, "Oh, well, it's a tradition and we're going to keep it up because, we want to survive." And these bad cultural markers are start to be almost deified by the dominated. They go, "Oh, yes, look at this really cool thing we did." And some of these cultural markers are totally useful. I don't want you to think that everything is bad. Like spam musubi came from those bad times. It's literally just rice on fried spam, or fried spam on rice, and made and in a design by the Japanese culture that introduced it. And it was entirely something to survive. But when people started to gain more influence and more in more money, they continued having spam musubi. And that was a comment by my teacher. She was just like, "Oh, when you're rich, do you really think you're going to have spam musubi at your table?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's good." And that's a thing. We have several traditions in the U.S. and in other cultures where, when you were impoverished, this was used for specific reasons. And now that that isn't happening, they're still continuing it on, but they don't understand why. Case in point, why don't you like the left? Why don't you like left-handedness? If you read in the Bible or other scriptures, you'll find that being on the left is a bad thing. It's in fact the term. The term itself in Latin is sinistra, which means left, but it also means evil. And the reason why is, at that time, there was a specific hand for, doing good things, and then there was a specific hand that was literally for crap and taking care of crappy things because they didn't have toilet paper and stuff. So being on the left hand meant you were on the crap side of things. And today, we have modern hygiene and stuff, so that's kind of gone away, but we're told, don't use your left hand. That's considered evil. And the reason why is, back at one time, it was the crap hand. But nobody has any cultural understanding of that. They just continued taking on the bad cultural markers into today. I'm fairly certain I was left-handed when I was born, but my grandmother just made sure I was right-handed because she was scared I would be, left-handed, and that's sinister. So that should give you an idea. Bad cultural markers continue to grow. Getting into more blunt statements, these immigration groups that come into the U.S., many of them had to create systems of, connections between each other and, willingness to break laws because that was the only way they could survive. They were taking on the crap jobs. And when they start to get money and power, they don't give those up. They continue taking on the money and the power, and they continue up with the networks that they've built. And there are, still groups like the Mafia, which is very rich, very powerful, and was actually based on an immigrant group that was just trying to survive. And that doesn't mean that all immigrants from that era are evil. It's just some of them haven't given up on these bad cultural markers. And because of that, we kind of all have this thing that's going on. And that's a thing we have to accept is as these people are, as the dominated gain more power, they don't give up their dominated sense in their mind. And then they'll have this kind of buffer period. We spoke about it a little on Friday where the dominant view themselves as dominant and the dominated view themselves as dominated, but they also start to recognize that they've got power and they've got influence, and they're like, you know what, I'm not going to take this anymore. I am not going to allow this person to treat me this way. I have influence, I am going to use it. And this buffer period is interesting because this is when the cycle switches from the dominant to the dominant become dominated by the formerly dominated. And it's just such a switch that they don't recognize it because culturally they haven't accepted it yet. It's all in their minds. And because of this, we often have times where horrible acts are done because they think that they have to protect themselves. And, the dominant are just completely confused on the matter because they're like, well, no, they should do as we say because we are the dominant ones and they are the dominated and they have to do as we say. And when they don't, it creates this mass amount of confusion. And when the dominated go, well, we don't have to do as they say, we have influence, we're not going to pay attention to them anymore, they still, in their minds, view the dominant as this overarching power from, 2 generations ago that was, giving them only crap jobs to live and making it so that survival was next to impossible. And so they are not recognizing that they've equalized a bit. And they start to push for more power than, really needed. And, they use these bad cultural markers to kind of continue moving up the scale. And suddenly things have switched. And the thing is, it's only in the minds of the people involved. Once again, this is the prison experience. By the time they've equalized, they still don't recognize it because it's in their minds. In their minds, they are still dominant because of these reasons given, even if that isn't true. And that is very difficult to tell people that this is happening, or that, the domination they've grown up with and they've been told about their entire lives just isn't there anymore because they can't recognize what equalization looks like. And the reason why is it looks nothing like what you imagined it to be. It ends in confusion. So, you push yourself to gain more power and more influence, and you don't know that point when you're like, wait, I've got all the power and influence I need to stop. Instead, you're going to keep pushing because that's what you've been doing for 2 generations now. So why should you give up? And the dominant view themselves as dominant because that's what it's been like for like 4 generations. So why should they view these people trying to push for power in any other way except as dominated? They don't accept in their minds that these are now equals that they're talking to. Neither side views each other as equals because it is purely in their minds and in their traditions. So the recognition of change is kind of this absolutely weird moment. This is the Boxer Rebellion, and the reason why it was a major thing is the Chinese, which had been dominant for 1,000 years, they'd lose power, they'd gain power, they'd have new dynasties, whatever. But the Chinese themselves, as a culture, had dominated. And suddenly the English, were making trade with them, and they were using opium to get silk from China. And whenever they talked about China, they still talked about it as if it was this great and grand culture that they were visiting. And they're like, oh, the Chinese do this. And, all these cultures were just like in awe of the Chinese, but at the time, the Chinese had so much infighting and robbers and problems that they couldn't really spend the time to care about the English and the other European powers. So at this point, the English, uh, the English and many other European powers started to take power in China, and they didn't recognize it at first until they started selling opium grown in India and what we call Pakistan today. It was India at the time. It took over this entire landmass, called it India, grew opium there, then sold the opium to the Chinese so that they could gain silk and tea that they could take back to England and Europe. And yes, really, that sounds insane, but it's true. And this they didn't recognize it until around the 1850s, 1860s, when they went, wait a minute, you know, we've got all this power. When did this happen? And this recognition of change is just this shock for the people, because in their minds, they've been dominated by these groups for so long, and then they recognize that this group that they've been fighting against, or that they've viewed as kind of this horrible thing, or not horrible, but as dominant to them, isn't there anymore, or is being dominated by you, and they don't know how to respond. During the same time as the Boxer rebellions and all that, the Chinese emperor said the English and the Europeans are an illness of the skin, very itchy and annoying, but really our problems, the major problems we have are a disease of the organs. This was a robber going through China, just killing people left and right. I actually don't know how many millions upon millions of people he killed or had killed. And, the Emperor of China viewed this guy way more importantly than he viewed, these silly Europeans who could be paid off quite easily to get just, oh, you want $10,000? Here you go. Here's $10,000. Get out of here. Oh, you want tea? Yeah, we've got plenty of tea. There you go. You can leave. And they just didn't view the Europeans with any power whatsoever. And, the same thing happened by the Japanese, and the many groups did not view these people, or did not view the change happening in the way that we imagine it. And then the 1850s happened, and people started to look at their maps and, how they were doing things. And the reality is they didn't have war going on in Europe as much. And they just started to, just stop and pause and look. And they just went, wait, how long have we ruled the world? When did we rule the world? When did this start? And this is where, the deified self began, where they just went, well, we've been doing this for years, so therefore we've dominated this entire time. And they changed the narrative to being dominant, to, barely being allowed into these areas by these grand and amazing cultures, to they do as we say because we say so, because we are greater than them. We are the dominant ones. And this recognition of change changes the narrative and the way they tell things to everybody. And then one generation passes, and in the minds of the people, it has always been this way. This is a movie poster for a movie called The Sand Pebbles, and it's about the Chinese rebellion in the, we'll say the late 19th century, or even into the 1930s. This is the World War II, and then the communist revolution in China. And the people in the boats view themselves as so dominant that they don't recognize the power that the local men have. And when they portray themselves as stronger, better, smarter, and everything they can think of against the Chinese. And it stars some absolutely amazing actors in in the movie. It's a well-acted film. And, this guy just, the captain of their ship just goes, no, we are going to dominate against these guys. Who do they think they are? We will destroy them. And, he just views it this way, where, he's treating these people as, slaves, and he just doesn't care. And he just can't recognize the change that's happened. And even when the makers of the movie released the movie, they viewed the Chinese in that way, as these, festering hive of stupid people, these crap job people that don't deserve this. And then they're getting on with stupid things, communism. Obviously, the reason why they're able to overcome us is because they're evil. They're doing all the evil things that the dominated do. And that sounds insane, but there really is a fight scene between a Chinese and an American, and the Chinese can't even, throw a punch. He's scared to death to even look at the other guy. 4 years later, Bruce Lee is releasing films of him beating the living snot out of white people. And everybody started accepting this idea that the Chinese could beat you up. Even into the 70s and 80s, the Chinese were viewed as kind of this lesser people. But as their manufacturing began to change and to improve, people started to view them in a different way. And now, when we talk about China, we view them as very dominant, very powerful, and this major force to be reckoned with. Now, if you were to talk to, say, the Chinese in China or in the Soviet Republic of China, the people there would just be like, "What are you talking about? We're all poor. None of us have a lot of money." But, their country is powerful. The companies in their country are powerful. They have people that are very, very rich. There are, movies are now being made more for the Chinese audience than the American audience. And just this entire domination has happened. And I just realized we're still in the buffer period between us and China. Pretty cool. And the same thing happens where, the dominant groups view themselves as dominant to the point of ridiculousness. A little earlier, I showed a slide about video games. And these two consoles were the consoles that everybody was arguing about who was going to, sell the most. And this really was, every article I read, everybody who talked about it was like, well, is it going to be the PS3 or the Xbox 360? This is an obvious thing. And they did not view the Wii as anything. They were like, well, it might still survive, but it's not going to last very long. And of this century, the top selling console to the most amount of people was the Wii. And it definitely dominated, and it completely changed the way we view video games. But to this day, the Sony people and the Microsoft people do not promote themselves to what they consider the Wii audience. They consider those the crap job people, and they talk about it in that way. And if you go onto networks and stuff, you'll find that many websites kind of have that same idea. Oh, Nintendo, they're the crap job people. Even though people are like, wait, this is Nintendo. They've been around longer than both of these companies combined. I mean, Nintendo started over 100 years ago, and they've survived, all sorts of things, whereas Sony hasn't. And Microsoft started in like the 70s, so they don't have the lasting power. But because in the minds of video gamers, these two consoles were dominant at that time, they could not see the Wii, or for this matter, the Switch. And it's just kind of ironic to watch. So, this is the domination cycle in a nutshell. This is not an attempt to explain everything to you. I don't think I could. I've wanted to write a book on the matter, but I just haven't taken the time to do it. So the next video is, why isn't this noticed? Why don't people notice the buffer periods and the domination cycles and stuff like that? And that's what we're going to really get into a little bit. And I think I might, I'm not promising, I'm going to show, using the equations I have shown a couple weeks back, why they view it this way and what's going on in their minds and why somebody can be tricked this way. So I will catch you all later and see you Friday.